Brandon Huffman. He is the 24/7 Sports National Recruiting Editor, here to talk about just how good this Alabama recruiting class was, and is it truly generational? And Brandon joins us now. Brandon, thanks for joining us. Where does this Alabama recruiting class rank?
Well, it just clinched the top overall spot in the history of 24/7 sports recruiting rankings, and they still may not be done. They're still in contention for the number one player in the country. But as of this morning, they have already inked with the pen pudding paper the number one class in the history of recruiting, with some of the most elite talent that you've seen. It's on par with their 2017 class that they signed with Devontae Smith and Najee Harris. But this class might be Nick Saban's best class that he's ever signed, which is saying something considering the success he's had in Tuscaloosa.
The best recruiting class prior to Alabama this year was turned in by Florida?
Yeah, Florida in 2010. And you could say that might have been the class that broke Urban Meyer at Florida and caused him to eventually walk away from that job. This class looks a little bit less risky than that Florida 2010 class did, and a lot of guys that I expect to play right away. But it wasn't just guys on the offensive line, defensive line, as Nick Saban always does. He gets players at every key position, and that's why this class ranks so high.
Where did you guys have Patrick Mahomes when he was coming out of high school?
So he was ranked as a high three-star coming out in that 2014 class behind guys like Kyle Allen, Keller Chris, who at the time was committed to Stanford, was being touted as the next Andrew Luck. Mahomes was kind of forgotten a little bit. Part of that reason was there was still a thinking that he might go the baseball route. There wasn't even certainty he was going to be a football player. Baseball was still looming there as a potential threat for him, but he was a high three-star and ultimately made a lot of people look really foolish with that decision.
And Trevor Lawrence was number one, and here he is going to go number one in the draft. Justin Fields was 2 in that recruiting class, and he'll be a first-round draft pick. So, we hit and miss at that position, but you're no different than the general managers in the NFL.
Sure. And I think when you look at that Lawrence Fields class, I mean, there was debate for part of that year. Who was better? Trevor Lawrence started out as the number one player. Justin Fields moved ahead. Ultimately, with Trevor Lawrence, it looks like he's going to be the number one pick in the 2021 draft. But those two were as good of a 1-2 punch as you've ever seen. And now, 3 years later, we look good on that. But there have been plenty of classes where you had guys, the 2013 class with Max Brown and Christian Hackenberg, those look like the safest 1-2 punch. Max Brown never really got it going at USC or at Pitt. Christian Hackenberg had an up and down career. So you have your misses. You want to follow those misses up with hits rather than go the other direction.
Give me the couple of names at that position that we'll be talking about in 2 years.
Well, the 2 top quarterbacks in the country are Caleb Williams, who's the number one dual threat quarterback out of Washington, D.C. He's already at Oklahoma, going in with the understanding that Spencer Rattler is going to be the starter at least in 2021, and then Williams will have a chance to compete for that job. And then the number one pro-style quarterback is a familiar name to fans out west in the name of Sam Heward, quarterback out of Kennedy Catholic High School in Burien, Washington. His father, Damon, former NFL quarterback. His uncle, Brock, former NFL quarterback. Both of his dad and his uncle played quarterback at the University of Washington. He actually committed to the Huskies 2 years ago when Chris Peterson was still the head coach, stayed with that commitment to Washington despite some late overtures from USC and some other schools. So he's a guy that even with Dylan Morris starting this year as a freshman, I wouldn't be surprised if he competes for the starting job, whereas Caleb Williams, like a couple of the Oklahoma quarterbacks before him, probably has to wait at least a year before we start to become with the next Lincoln Riley sensation.
Where is the number one recruit on 24/7 going?
Well, that's a very good question. We're still trying to figure that out, and it's probably going to be 2 months. That player is JT Tuimoloau out of Eastside Catholic in Samamas, Washington. He, on the early signing period, named his final 5 of Alabama, Ohio State, Washington, Oregon, and USC. So you have 3 Pac-12 schools relatively close to home, one being the hometown Huskies, another being Oregon, which is just down the road, USC, where his family is largely from Southern California. Then you have the 2 teams playing for the national championship. And it's really been those 2 teams out in front for him, Alabama and Ohio State. Part of the reason he's waiting is with the NCAA dead period, he has never had a chance to visit Columbus. He still has not been out to Ohio State. He did camp at Alabama when he was a sophomore. So he wants to get back down to Tuscaloosa and get out to Columbus with his family to see both those schools. He's more familiar with the Pac-12 schools, but we're at least 2 months away from him making a decision. Ohio State, Alabama played for the national championship. Now they're playing to see who gets the number one overall player. But those 3 Pac-12 schools trying to get relevance back into the conference are hoping he decides to stay closer to home.
Brandon, we talk about this on the show occasionally. Ole Miss, Tennessee, where sometimes you don't expect a school to have a really, really good recruiting class. And when you do that, all of a sudden, that's when people start to notice. Did anybody have an out of the ordinary recruiting class this year? You know, Tennessee had it last spring. They paid the price this year. Anybody that you look at and you go, wow, I didn't expect them to be up in the top 10 or top 15?
Yeah, I would say, Maryland is just outside the top 15, considering the struggles that they've had on the field the last few years. It is kind of a surprise to see Maryland ranked so high, especially when that state's been really bleeding the top players in the state. Maryland has become a frequent stop for Big Ten schools, for ACC schools, for SEC schools, and they've had a hard time keeping them. But Mike Locksley, ever since he was at Florida, when he was at New Mexico, Alabama, he's always been known as a recruiter, always been known as one of the best recruiters. In fact, he was one of the first coaches in all of college football to start getting bonuses based on where his recruiting class ranked, which kind of dispelled the longtime myth that coaches said rankings don't matter when there was 50, 60,000 reasons for it to matter. Mike Locksley's been able to overcome kind of an up and down start to his career at Maryland as the head coach by following it up with a very good recruiting effort in the last couple of years, culminating with a top 20 class. So when you see Maryland in there and kind of sandwiched between schools that you expect to be there, it is one of those schools that does have you scratching your head a little bit. But if you look at Locksley's history as a recruiter, it's not as surprising as, say, when Hugh Freeze had Ole Miss in the top 10 or Tennessee with their struggles ended up with a top 10 class.
How did Sark do at Texas?
Sark inherited a large number of these guys that already signed with Tom Herman. It was a top 20 class already when he got there. Now, one of the big things for them is that they've already gotten a commitment from one of the top running backs in the country for next year. He committed yesterday. So they were hoping to get LJ Johnson, who was the top uncommitted back in the state of Texas. It's looking like he's going to choose Texas A&M. But Sark, really the big thing for him was getting that top running back to commit for 2022. And really what it's going to come down to for Sark is, how does he do with the efforts of Quinn Ewers, who was once committed to Texas, decommitted, committed to Ohio State? He's the number one player in the country for 2022. Can Sark get Texas back in it, or is Quinn Ewers a lost cause? But I think considering the timing of when Sark was hired, being in January, he's walking into a pretty well put together class. 2022 is going to be that first class we're really going to be able to judge just how well a job Sarkisian's doing as a recruiter at the University of Texas.
Thank you, Brandon. We had a lot of fun looking at the website today, and we appreciate your time.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it.
That's Brandon Huffman, National Recruiting Editor for 24/7